A flight full of restless passengers. A crying child. A weary single dad in seat 12F, just trying to get home. But when the plane hits unexpected turbulence and panic spreads, this quiet man stands up and says just two words that change everything. Moments later, two F-22 pilots patrolling nearby receive a call sign over the radio they haven't heard in years, Falcon 1. What they do next leaves every passenger and millions watching later in absolute tears. Michael Smith wasn't anyone special. At least, that's what he told himself most mornings. A widowed father raising his 10-year-old son, Jack, he worked long shifts as an aircraft mechanic at the local hangar. His hands were always scarred with grease, his heart worn thin by loss. Since losing his wife, Laura, 2 years earlier, every day felt like a mission. Get Jack to school, make ends meet, keep promises no one else remembered. Despite the exhaustion, Michael carried himself with quiet discipline, the kind that came from years in uniform. What few knew was that he once flew F-16s with precision that could silence a room of soldiers. His call sign, Falcon 1, a name once whispered with respect and sorrow, but that was another life. Now he just fixed planes, not flew them. And today, Seat 12F was just supposed to take him and Jack to his sister's house for a quiet weekend away. As Michael boarded, he smiled politely at the flight attendant, helped an elderly woman with her bag, and guided Jack to the window seat. The kind of man you'd barely notice until the sky demanded otherwise. Before we continue with this incredible journey, I spent countless hours researching and crafting this story to bring you something truly meaningful. If stories like this touch your heart, and you want to see more acts of kindness that restore faith in humanity, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. It means the world to me and helps these stories reach others who need them most. Now, let's see what happens next. Have you ever witnessed an act of kindness that completely changed your perspective? Share your story in the comments below. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane ascended into the thick, gray clouds. The air hummed with the low murmur of engines and restless passengers. A baby cried somewhere near the back. A flight attendant whispered reassurance to a nervous traveler. And in seat 12F, Michael Smith sat quietly calm, steady, his hand resting protectively on the shoulder of his sleeping son, Jack. For a moment, everything was peaceful. Then came the jolt that a violent tremor shook the aircraft, rattling trays and hearts alike. Gasps echoed through the cabin as the plane tilted slightly, fighting turbulence that rolled like invisible waves. The captain's voice cracked through the intercom, firm but shaken. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Michael felt Jack's hand grip his. He squeezed back gently, whispering, "It's okay, buddy. Just a bit of rough air." But he could hear it, the tremor in the pilot's voice. The kind of tremor a trained ear could never mistake. Something was wrong. The flight attendants moved quickly, but fear began to ripple through the passengers. The plane dipped again, a few screams rose, and someone began to pray aloud. Michael's instincts, the ones he thought he'd buried with his old flight suit, came rushing back. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up slowly despite the shaking floor, and looked toward the galley where one of the attendants clung to a handle for balance. "You need help stabilizing?" he asked calmly. Her eyes widened. "Sir, please sit down." I'm not panicking," he said softly, his tone steady and commanding in a way that silenced her hesitation. "Former Air Force. Call sign Falcon 1. That name hit like a thunderclap, though no one around him understood its weight. He made his way toward the cockpit, moving with the balance of a man who had faced worse skies. Inside, the captain and co-pilot struggled to regain control amid strong crosswinds. Michael didn't barge in. He simply leaned in the doorway and said quietly, "Level your wings 3 degrees to starboard. Now ease off the throttle. You've got a downdraft pushing from the northeast." The captain turned, startled. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been up here before," Michael replied. "Trust me." There was a moment of hesitation, then the pilot followed his guidance. The plane steadied. The rattling eased. The passengers exhaled. Minutes later, calm filled the air once more. From the cockpit radio came a faint burst of static, a voice crackling through the frequency. "This is Eagle 2. We picked up a distress signal earlier. Who's guiding that civilian flight?" The captain looked toward Michael, confused. Michael hesitated only a second, then leaned forward and pressed the comm button. His voice was calm, measured, familiar to those who once flew under his lead. "This is Falcon 1, he said. There was silence. Then the voice on the radio replied, respectful, almost reverent. "Copy that, Falcon 1. Good to hear you again, sir." Back in the cabin, no one knew what had just happened. To them, he was just a quiet mechanic, a widowed dad who'd kept everyone calm. But above the clouds, two F-22 pilots banked their jets alongside the civilian flight, escorting it through the storm, a silent salute to the man in seat 12F who once led them through darker skies. The flight landed safely to thunderous applause. Passengers clapped, some in tears, some clutching strangers' hands. To them, it felt like a miracle. But to Michael, it was just instinct, something he'd done 1,000 times before. Long ago, when his life was louder, prouder, and full of sky.as, the plane taxied to the gate. A flight attendant quietly approached. "Sir," she whispered, her voice still trembling from the adrenaline. "The captain said you might have saved us." Michael smiled gently. "The crew saved us," he said. "I just reminded the sky who's boss." He turned back to Jack, who beamed with pride. "Dad, everyone's talking about you," the boy said. "You're like a secret superhero." Michael chuckled. "No, Jack. Just someone who remembers what it feels like to be afraid and how to stay calm anyway." But what Michael didn't realize was that someone had filmed part of it. A fellow passenger, capturing the moment he stood up to help the cockpit, had posted it online with the caption, "Seat 12F just saved our flight." Within hours, it went viral. By the time they reached baggage claim, reporters were waiting. Cameras flashed. Questions flew. "Are you Falcon 1? The Air Force legend?" Michael froze. The call sign he hadn't heard in years now echoed through the terminal like an old ghost. He didn't want the spotlight. Not anymore. After his wife passed, all he'd wanted was a quiet life for Jack. School, homework, laughter, peace. No uniforms. No medals. Just love and normalcy. But the world doesn't stay quiet when it finds a story that inspires hope. The next morning, his small town was buzzing. His neighbors, who'd known him as the friendly mechanic, were suddenly looking at him with a "WAT work." His boss clapped him on the back. "You're trending worldwide, Mike. Falcon 1 hero mechanic. You should be proud." Michael smiled politely. "Heroes don't trend, Jim. They move on." Still, deep down, he felt something stir, that old spark, the purpose he thought he'd lost when he took off the wings. But fame brought other things too. A reminder of loss, of why he'd left it all behind. At home, Jack had questions. "Dad, why didn't you tell me you were a pilot?" Michael sighed, kneeling beside him. "Because, kiddo, that part of my life ended when your mom died. She was my co-pilot." Jack's eyes softened. "But maybe she'd want you to fly again, even if it's just in a different way." Those words hit deeper than any metal could. Days later, an envelope arrived. Inside was a formal invitation sealed with an Air Force insignia. The note read, "The men of the 22nd Fighter Wing would like to formally recognize Falcon 1 for his service and courage." Michael hesitated. He didn't want attention. But Jack insisted. "Dad, they remember you. You should go." And so he did. He and Jack boarded a military transport to the base where the very same F-22 pilots who had recognized his call sign mid-flight were waiting. As Michael stepped off the ramp, both pilots snapped to attention. The crowd around them fell silent. One of them removed his helmet, voice thick with emotion. "Sir, when we heard your voice up there, we couldn't believe it. You taught half of us how to fly and the other half how to lead." Michael stood there, humbled, his son watching wide-eyed beside him. The sun caught his eyes, and for the first time in years, he stood tall, shoulders back, not as a broken widower, but as the man he once was. The ceremony was simple but powerful. Rows of Air Force personnel stood in formation under the open sky, the sound of flags snapping in the wind. Michael walked across the tarmac beside Jack, feeling both the weight of memory and the lift of pride. The base commander stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Welcome home, Falcon 1. Michael hesitated for a moment, then took the handshake. Applause rippled through the ranks. Cameras clicked. But in that instant, it wasn't about recognition. It was about closure. The ghosts of the past didn't haunt him anymore. They saluted him quietly. After the ceremony, one of the young pilots, barely older than 25, approached with a shaky voice. "Sir, I grew up hearing stories about you. When I was ready to quit training, my instructor said, remember Falcon 1? He never gave up, even when the mission fell apart. You kept me going. Michael smiled, placing a steady hand on the pilot's shoulder. Then do the same for the next one. That's how this works. We keep each other flying. Jack watched from a few feet away, his chest swelling with pride. He'd never seen his father like this strong, calm, but alive in a way that only purpose could bring. That night, at a small gathering inside the hangar, Michael shared stories of resilience, teamwork, and the quiet courage it takes to rebuild after loss. The men and women around him listened, not to a hero, but to a man who had lived through fear and learned grace on the other side of it. When they returned home, the world had changed again. The viral clip had inspired thousands. Veterans reached out to thank him. Airline crews wrote messages about staying calm under pressure. Schools invited him to speak to students about discipline and kindness, but Michael didn't chase any of it. He went back to his workshop, back to fixing planes, one rivet at a time. Only now, there was a different rhythm in his hands, a lighter step in his walk. He started mentoring young mechanics at the hangar, some of them struggling, some directionless, reminding them that greatness isn't about medals, it's about moments. He never mentioned the Air Force unless they asked. And when they did, he just smiled and said, I used to fly. Now I help others take off. A few weeks later, he and Jack were boarding another flight, this time for a well-earned trip to visit his late wife's parents. The flight attendant smiled at them warmly. Seats 12E and 12F, she said. Right this way. As they sat down, Jack leaned closer. Dad, it's the same seat. Michael chuckled softly. Yeah, I guess it is. Maybe the sky isn't finished with us yet. Halfway through the flight, the captain came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to acknowledge a special passenger on board today, someone whose calm courage reminded us all what leadership looks like. Mr. Michael Smith, or as the Air Force knows him, Falcon 1. Thank you for your service. The cabin erupted in applause. Passengers turned to look, some with tears in their eyes, some saluting quietly. Jack grinned so wide it nearly split his face. Michael simply nodded, hand over his heart, his voice barely a whisper. Once a pilot, always a pilot. And in that moment, Seat 12F wasn't just a place on a plane, it was a symbol, a reminder that the smallest acts of courage, even in the quiet corners of our lives, can echo far beyond what we see. Months passed, but the story of the man in Seat 12F didn't fade, it grew wings. News outlets replayed the footage of Michael's calm leadership during the flight. Aviation forums lit up with tributes. Veterans groups began calling him the Silent Falcon, a symbol of grace under pressure. Yet Michael never sought the spotlight. He turned down interviews, redirecting attention to the young mechanics and pilots who were still finding their way. At home, life found a peaceful rhythm again. Jack, once shy about his father's quiet nature, now walked with pride. His friends at school whispered, That's Falcon 1's son, but Jack only smiled and said, He's just my dad. Michael had begun teaching weekend workshops at a local aviation school, free sessions for kids who couldn't afford training. He told them not about glory, but about purpose. You don't need wings to make a difference, he'd say. Sometimes, it's about keeping others steady when everything's shaking apart. One of those sessions caught the attention of an F-22 squadron commander who showed up unannounced one Saturday. After watching Michael guide a nervous teen through a hands-on repair, the commander stepped forward. Falcon 1, he said, with deep respect. The Air Force would like to name a mentorship program after you. One that teaches not just flying, but leadership through humility. Michael was silent for a moment, his eyes softening. Then make sure every name on that list knows they matter, even the ones no one sees. Weeks later, the program, the Falcon Initiative, launched nationally, connecting retired veterans with struggling youth. It wasn't just about aviation. It was about hope, direction, and second chances. In a touching ceremony, two F-22 jets soared overhead in perfect formation, their engines roaring across the horizon. Jack stood by his father, watching with awe. Dad, that's for you. Michael shook his head with a smile. No, son. That's for everyone who ever thought their best days were behind them. The image of those jets painted across the sky became a symbol, a reminder that quiet strength still exists, that kindness can travel farther than any flight path, and that heroes often walk among us in ordinary clothes, sitting quietly in seat 12F. Stories like this remind us that true greatness isn't about medals, uniforms, or titles. It's about what we do when no one's watching. If this story touched your heart, please like this video. It helps more people discover these real-life moments of courage and compassion. Subscribe for more tales of humanity that will restore your faith in kindness. And most importantly, look around you. The next hero might be sitting right beside you. What act of kindness will you perform this week? Share it in the comments because every small gesture can change a life. Thank you for watching, and remember, heroes don't always fly. Sometimes, they simply help others rise.